I wrote a song called Angamizi on the Thieves Banquet, which some of you may know, some of you may not know. Angamizi is a Swahili term, and it translates roughly to the same sort of concept or idea as the word Holocaust, as a racist, genocidal campaign of brutality towards a particular group of people. And in the Pan-African world, in the Pan-African tradition, the term Angamizi refers to the entire process of colonialism, enslavement, neo-colonialism, the development of racist, anti-African, anti-black ideas, and their direct physical political manifestation. So that's what Angamizi means. That's what it sums up. And if you listen to my song, I think you'll get a sense of the meaning and the ideology behind it. I must say it was inspired by, it didn't come out of a vacuum, it was inspired by, I went on a course with a lawyer called Esther Stanford Jose, who's a lawyer and activist who is a reparations lawyer, so someone who looks at reparatory justice. And I went on a course around the idea of reparations and the case for reparations from a legal standpoint. And I learned a whole load of stuff I had really no idea about on that course. And saw how solid actually the legal case for reparations is in a Pan-African context, which is one of the reasons the British state and other states will avoid directly apologising for Britain's role in transatlantic slavery and neo-colonialism and coups and etc. Because a direct apology from a head of state or from someone in a position of power would open, in a legal sense, from what I understand, would open up the conversation for reparations even more, which is why the language is always picked very carefully. People can express regret, but they can't apologise. And that's some of what I learned on this course, which was really fascinating to me. I learned about the amount of minerals that have been dug out of the African continent over the past kind of 500 years. I learned about even more mechanics around the way aid works and the kind of corruption behind that. I learned a little bit more about the fact that of payments, odious debt, if you like, the way that odious debt is still used as a weapon of war and neo-colonialism against those states, etc, etc, etc. I mean, it was a fantastic course where I learned so much, but I learned particularly about this idea of and struggle for Pan-African reparations and how it connects to other forms of reparatory justice around the world. Because of course, when you hear about Pan-African reparations, the mainstream media and a lot of our society will just be like, oh, crazy black people campaigning for something that ended hundreds of years ago. Why are they always whinging? You know how people are, very, very stupid. But when you look at the direct manifestations and the direct lineage, so if we look in American context, the direct lineage between the ending of slavery and then chain gangs and convict leasing and of course private prisons today, you can literally draw that straight line and see very clearly the legacy of that in America. If we take Brazil, the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1888, and the policies that are outlined in Abdias do Nascimento's book, Brazil, Mixture or Massacre. From 1888 onwards, the Brazilian government had a policy that at the time they called getting rid of the black stain. It was an open policy of trying to get rid of that population of enslaved Africans that Brazil had become very scared of. We can see a direct lineage between the ending of slavery in Brazil in 1888 and the situation for Afro-Brazilians today in 2012. Police brutality, the fact that the overwhelming majority of that population, who are actually the majority of the population of Brazil, live in favelas, etc, etc, etc. That lineage is very clear. If we move to, say, Haiti, the first country in the world, as we've discussed many times before, to properly abolish slavery after defeating the French, the British and the Spanish. Haiti was invaded by America in 1915. A debt was placed on Haiti in 1825 by the French under threat of reinvasion to pay France reparations for Haitians gaining their own freedom, for robbing France of their property. That money was still being paid off post-World War II, so we're not talking about ancient history. To say nothing of the coups that have existed in Haiti, foreign-backed coups, as recently as 2004. So we can clearly see the legacies and current activity of racist neo-colonialism in a Pan-African context. So to think that these are ancient issues, especially with police brutality being so much in the news recently, is really quite ridiculous. But people would have you believe these are ancient issues and it's just crazy black people being mad. But even if we look at it from the perspective of workers' rights, you know, to use a kind of more well understood analysis, the worst form of worker exploitation of the past half a millennia, without question, in my mind at least, was the transatlantic traffic in enslaved Africans. The legacies of that in all of the places both where Africans were taken from and where they landed, are still very, very clear in the living standards of people and the opportunities available, etc., etc., etc. So even from a perspective of workers' rights, a victory for Pan-African reparations is a victory for workers' rights anywhere in the world, and a victory for the redistribution of what, in my view, is ill-gotten wealth by a lot of the political and business elite of the world that we live in today. A lot of the powerful and rich corporations and peoples. So, for example, in a British context, the slave owners, not the enslaved people, the slave owners were given £20 million reparations at the end of slavery, which is equivalent to roughly 16 billion today, we're told. And of course, they invested that in various industrial projects in the UK, etc. And it's fascinating to the British public because that was your money they were given. Yeah, think about that. The owners and traffickers of human beings were given public money at a time when living standards for poor people in Britain were horrific. Nonetheless, they were given public money for the loss of their property over in the Caribbean. And their property, of course, was my grandmother's great-grandmother and other people of African heritage. It's fascinating because that was the largest public bailout until the bankers' bailout of 2008. So these things have very relevant contemporary manifestations, but the mainstream media and our universities and the way and the general obscurification, if that's the correct word, and I don't think I've pronounced that word correctly, but it's funny, but the general making things hazy and making things unclear and avoiding facts and avoiding any real discussion around these subjects is one of the ways that people avoid what is a very clear context. So to give yourself some context, you could read Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams, you could read How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, you could read The West and the Rest of Us by Professor Chinwezu, you could read Dead Aid by Adam Bisamuyo, you could read so many books that look at manifestations of neo-colonialism and give you a historical context and a legal context. Visit stopthematangamizi.com. Pan-African reparations is part of an international campaign for reparatory justice in the world. I would suggest people do a little bit more research and understand the principles and history of reparatory justice before they pass judgment and make a conclusion. For more information and understand that reparations, reparatory justice, is one of the key components, in my view, of a march toward any form of global justice in the 21st century. Stopthematangamizi.com. Big up, ladies and gentlemen. Catch you soon.